Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books live stream. Welcome to December. Welcome to snow in some places. Here in Wheeling, we have snow. Today, first, let me tell you about next week. We will have a program led by Rabbi Leaf from Temple Shalom, in which we will explore all of the winter holidays, including especially Hanukkah for those of us who are not Jewish. He will explain, and I'm looking forward to that program next week at noon on the 8th. Today, we have a special program. This gentleman has been with us before, several years ago. Many of you will remember. Dr. Kirk Hazen is a professor of linguistics at West Virginia University, where he is the founding director of the West Virginia Dialect Project and a Benedum Distinguished Scholar in the Humanities. His research, teaching, and linguistic service are all centered on the social and linguistic problems of language variation. Excuse me, I can't see as well as I used to. His most recent book is An Introduction to Language, and he is a co-editor of Research Methods in Sociolinguistics. Here is Dr. Kirk Hazen.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. We have snow here also in Morgantown, and it is absolutely gorgeous to see. Today, I'm going to talk about the latest book from me and many of my colleagues. That's Appalachian Englishes in the 21st Century. This is by West Virginia University Press, which has become quite famous lately because of the National Book Awards. And this book was motivated because we have studied varieties of English in Appalachia since at least the beginning of the 20th century, but really in earnest in modern ways since the late 1960s. One of the early scholars who was most influential in the study was Michael Montgomery, an intellectual giant who loved Appalachia as much as anyone I've ever met. Michael passed away somewhat recently, and this book brings together a lot of the scholarship and a lot of the scholars that he helped to influence. So in this book, it's about a modern understanding of language in Appalachia. So in many of the chapters, these authors work with stereotypes, work with misunderstandings of what Appalachia is and about language, about dialects in Appalachia. We want to show how English dialects in Appalachia actually do work and how people use them in their daily lives. So I'll go through some different chapters and work around some of the ideas in this book. As an overall goal, we want readers to better understand language, dialect variation, and importantly, Appalachia itself. With this greater understanding, we really hope to dispel myths about Appalachia. And really, since this book does summarize a lot of our modern understanding of what scholarship is available out there, this is really a leaping off point. There's a lot more scholarship that's going to happen in the future than has happened in the past in terms of dialects in Appalachia. There's a lot of hope and progress moving forward. So it's a little bit of a retrospective, but in lots of ways, this is a leaping off point for future work about dialects in Appalachia. Now, one thing I know folks are going to have a question about is why in this book does the title and all the way throughout it have Englishes with the plural ES there. It's something that your spell checker and your word processing program is never going to like, but Englishes is in the plural, has been used since at least the late 1980s in scholarly realms. And we use it because English has become such a worldwide language. There's so much variation in the different dialects of English that it's perfectly legitimate to call them different Englishes now. There's well over 100 different varieties of English around the world. The British Empire did a very thorough job of spreading itself out and planting seeds of English. And those English varieties have grown different. As they've grown in different directions, they have grown more different from each other. That's not a bad thing. Variation in human language is the norm. It's part of who we are as a species, and it's part of what defines us. So English variation itself is the norm, and Englishes as a plural has been used for decades. So why Appalachian Englishes? Up until the mid 2000s, most scholars who wrote about dialects in Appalachia talked about Appalachian English, singular. In doing this, there was just an odd monolithic quality to this description. We would talk about it as if it were in some places in Appalachia and not in other places in Appalachia. And when you talk to people, West Virginia, Kentucky, Western North Carolina, when you talk to folks about where Appalachian English was, plenty of people would say, well, not exactly here, but further up. You'll see further down that road, right in that holler down there, that's where you'll find some real Appalachian English. Then it became a matter of comparison, like more or less. And what do you do with folks from, let's say, Clarksburg, who have 5 generations back from Bethlehem, from St. Clairsville? What do you do with all these places where you have generations of people who have spoke a variety of English all this time and are in Appalachia? Do you say they're not Appalachian English? It became a very constricting definition, and one that didn't allow us to describe most of the English speakers actually in the Appalachian region. So the question comes up, what do you do with a term? We avoided the term from then on out, and many scholars did not use the term Appalachian English as an entity because it, as a term, it stopped having a whole lot of meaning by itself. So what's in this book? There's 3 different parts to this book itself. And the idea is that it gives overviews of different qualities through that language can interact with people. On the first part, it's about qualities of the language itself. So it deals with basically the regional boundaries. It deals with the actual linguistics. So we'll talk about some of those chapters coming up. In the second part, it deals with language and society. It deals with how people build meanings of their language and discourse. It deals with language and gender and language and ethnicity. And that's a quality we wanted to make sure we had in this book, is that at every opportunity to talk about ethnic diversity in Appalachia, we make sure we point it out and mention it, because it's been there for a long time, but it's not there in popular imagination of what of Appalachia. And we want to make sure we were correcting those misconstruals of diversity in Appalachia. The last part is language in the wider world. And in that part, the authors deal with language in memes, always a popular subject, language in literature, and then 2 different chapters on language and education. So the way that language interacts further out. All right. And I see some questions coming in. Please keep the questions coming. I will be glad to answer these as we move along. Some of them I might hold till later. Some of them I might hit up directly. So one of the first questions that comes up actually is part of many chapters in this book and is addressed in different ways. The first question, does the Appalachian and specifically Smoky Mountain English dialect have Elizabethan English roots? All right. This is, of all the things I've been asked, probably the thing I've been asked most in my 22 years since I've come to West Virginia. There's an easy answer, and then there's something more complex that's a side answer. The easy answer is no. Elizabethan English was done in 1603, and nothing in Appalachia was being settled until much later. So Elizabethan English was not part of the settlement of Appalachia and did not directly influence it in any way. Even if aliens had transported Elizabethan English speakers over here and plopped them down, their variety still would have changed a great deal from that time. Why did that ever come up? The idea of Elizabethan English came up as kind of an apology for the region. There was a president of Berea College, William Goodell Frost, 1900, first writing we have that lays this out, that was trying to make a pitch for Berea College, president of the college, trying to make a pitch, and said, listen, the folks around here are not backwards and horrible in some way. They are simply your modern day ancestors. They have the language and qualities of folks from an earlier time. Pick Chaucer, pick some earlier time. No one cared about facts. And in doing that, Frost was trying to lay out an argument that the differences were holdover for people frozen in time. Now, there's a lot to be said about this idea of being frozen in time, and I would refer you to Elizabeth Catt's book, What You Were Getting Wrong About Appalachia, which I have right over here. This idea, though, is still a popular one, and I take its popularity to be something much more like rooting for your favorite sports team. If you think of teams that are Badgers or Wolverines or other such creatures, when you're cheering, let's go Badgers, no one actually believes the players in the fields are Badgers. But they're all enthused, and there's a Badger costume person running around. It's about enthusiasm for a group. Now, there's probably a lot to be said about that, but I see this enthusiasm for it to be really much more of group identity. But the direct answer is no. It has no basis in Elizabethan English, or no more so than any other variety of American English, let's say. All right. So certainly, if you want, keep the questions rolling. I'm going to talk about a few things in the first part of the book and see how far we can get along in here. By the way, all of the scholars in this book are well-established and wonderful scholars in their own right. My role was simply as editor and slightly as contributor to this book, but this is very much a group effort from a lot of dedicated and wonderful people. So the first chapter is a little bit about regional boundaries, but it links in that question of history also. First chapter is by Daniel Hastings. It takes up about exactly what and where is Appalachia. And if you don't know, Appalachia is a area that is not something not well defined, to say the least. It is a area that is federally designed, designated, but it is not an area that everybody agrees on. So even scholars of this book do not all agree on where they think Appalachia is. And we're all okay with that. We're all okay with not having a definite answer. So some people think Appalachia is just parts of West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, but certainly not the Pittsburgh area, certainly no county in New York. Let me actually see if I can share my screen here, let my host know. I'm going to try to share a certain window. There we go. This is a map from the Appalachian Regional Commission. This is a commission set up in 1965 to help out certain counties that were undergoing economic distress. There's a lot more socially about why the Appalachian Regional Commission was set up, but I will leave that to your own reading. The region here is one that can, basically the counties in this region are able to apply for federal funds, if available, and other assistance. And it was about improving economic conditions in the county. If you might imagine, it probably doesn't require a dialectologist to tell you that there is not one dialect that runs from southern counties in New York to the eastern counties in Mississippi. That is not one variety. It has never been one variety. So even within this large map of Appalachia, there's many different varieties of Appalachian English. What Daniel Hasty talks about is the sound differences that divide parts of Appalachia. And he draws a major distinction between northern Appalachia and southern Appalachia. This runs through roughly the middle of West Virginia, based on maps from a few different folk. And it's based on qualities like the vowel differences we can hear in words like ride and mine. So something like mine versus ride is called ion gliding. It's changing a two-part vowel, the I vowel, to a one-part vowel. And above in northern Appalachia, that's done less often. In southern Appalachia, it's done more often. And we'll get to the yins, yuns, and y'all question coming up. Another feature that divides northern and southern Appalachia is what's called ash breaking in words like bad, bat. The a vowel, if it's a two-part vowel, which I am not good at reproducing, but it's something like bad. If it's a two-part vowel, that's a more southern feature. If it's a one-part vowel in there, it's more of a northern feature. The third one, everyone try this at home, is whether certain words sound the same or not, whether vowels merge in your dialect. So everyone say out loud the word C-O-T, C-O-T, and then the word C-A-U-G-H-T. Now, either you came up with two words that sounded the same, cot and cot, or you came up with cot and caught. If those two words sounded the same, then you have what's called the low-back merger, because in the low-back part of your vowel space, those two vowels are overlapping. So that's a feature of Pennsylvania, and Western Pennsylvania, and parts of West Virginia. So let me share here another map. This is not our map. This is from a book by Lobove, Ash, and Boberg. And there it is. This book is Atlas of North American English. It's an absolutely fabulous book. I suggest you get it at the library. It's still kind of expensive. And what you can see here in this green line is where you have the low-back merger, where the cot and caught are pronounced the same. It's also true that you find a lot of cot and caught pronounced the same west of here too. Wheeling was the gateway to the west, and certainly the low-back merger flowed through that gateway. So this red line, by the way, is the line for I ungliding that was found in this survey. So you found it below this line, but less often above this line in terms of geography. So those are the kinds of features that we use as linguists to figure out divisions in dialect varieties. And that's two of our major divisions. Let me take a look here at some of the questions. We're going to come up on yins. Social media pop, Glottal Stop. I can certainly talk about that a little more at the end in there. So remind me about that one when we get up to the end of the talk. So the second chapter deals with just sound differences, gets into all the sound variations that are the most noticeable for bits of Appalachia. Some of them are consonant variations like which and which, the difference between W-I-T-C-H and W-H-I-C-H. If you notice, the spelling difference is a historical holdover. If you pronounce those two the same, which and which, then those two sounds are merged for you. If you pronounce them differently, that means you maintain the distinction that was historically there. There's not a right or wrong here. This is just a feature of language variation. But the original had the distinction there, and that's why there's a spelling distinction. I don't have that distinction. It doesn't stop me from spelling the words differently, but I don't have that distinction in there. But that's one of the differences found throughout Appalachia. Another one, and a very important one, is what's called the Southern vowel shift. And the Southern vowel shift has to do with movement of vowels around in the mouth, and it's a very systematic pattern. PBS did a very good special called Do You Speak American, where they had an excellent discussion of this. I'll show you the and share with you our representation. This is by Paul Reed, this chapter, and there we go. And in the Southern vowel shift, Paul talks about how words like bit and beat are basically trading places. So a be it, instead of bit is be it, and instead of beat is bit. And something like bait and bet, where you have bet would be bay it, and it's these vowels are trading places. Some of the back vowels are also shooting forward. So instead of boot, you get butte. These differences mark Southern speakers in general throughout the southeastern region of the United States, but it's also part of Appalachia. Let me try to do that for this one. Is that better? It's bigger, at least. All right. The idea here is these changes are systematic. They do happen over decades, but they can sometimes be reversed. We know from studies of West Virginia that in northern West Virginia, speakers born 1919 in the 1920s actually had these kinds of changes. But anyone born after World War II, these changes were not adopted, and in general, people avoided these changes in the northern part of the state. In the southern part of the state, these became associated with more rural areas. So social divisions influence these kinds of dialect patterns. And a lot of the people who contributed to this book are some form of a sociolinguist. Not all, though. We had a wide variety of contributors to this book. So that's some of the differences that Paul Reed talks about in chapter 2. The chapter 3 deals with grammar, and this is where I'll talk about y'all and yins in there. And in chapter 3, I talk about some of the stigma that has played on language variation patterns. Stigma is a large driver of language variation. And you can see its effect in West Virginia, where certain patterns using demonstrative them. Demonstrative them is a feature where them is used instead of those or these. So how about them apples? And this usage is one that declined rapidly, and again, after World War II, along with another usage that was very common throughout large parts of Appalachia, which is leveled was, using things like we was, you was, and the ducks was. This also dropped off precipitously right after World War II till modern day usage hovers around anywhere from 5 to 15%. So stigma has a large influence on what goes on, but on other patterns it doesn't. With something like ing variation, walking versus walk in, there's been no change over time in the studies of Appalachia that we've done. The second person plural y'all is an interesting foil to stigma, because the second person paradigm is one that's been in flux for a while. I will share here, if I can find it real quick, a set of pronouns from early modern English and slightly before. In earlier forms of English, our pronouns actually had, there we go, to share this up here. In earlier forms of English, we had pronouns that distinguish between second person, trying to adjust the wrong thing, that distinguish between second person singular and second person plural. And I'll just blow this up here. So distinguish between thou, thee, and thine, and you, and your. Fairly nice distinction. You know which one's which. But after this period, for various reasons, the thou, thee, and thine dropped off, got kicked out, no longer part of the island. With this change, varieties of English have been scrambling ever since to make a distinction, because there's ambiguity with you being singular versus plural. You don't know. So different varieties have gone with yous, with yins, with yuins, with y'all. And it is regionally, I don't want to say constrained, but there's some regional qualities to it. Clearly, Pittsburgh and Pittsburghers have gone with yins, and they can self-identify as yinzer. It's become a matter of pride. Many Southerners have taken up y'all as a form, but yuin is one that has been around, but has really, at least for Southern Appalachia, been moved out in favor of y'all, at least last part of the 20th century. But this here, this thou, thee, and thine, the dropping of that from our system is what triggered all the different second person plural forms to come up. So that's a normal part of language change, and one that should be celebrated and not disparaged. All right. So there is the Yin's question. Up next in the book is discourse. So discourse deals with how meaning is created in conversation. The patterns of discourse are sort of like reading a text and trying to figure out what goes on. Alison Burkett tackles discourse in the book, and she gives a nice story with a feature that people really like about Appalachia. And it's a feature that doesn't show up that much in conversation, but it shows up in stories like this. So this is from Burkett's chapter. This is a story that she was told, she being the writer here. And it says, a story told to him by his mother about hearing ghost horses pull up to the house of a relative who was dying. So here's the story. So they stepped through the gate at the edge of the little old gravel road, and they heard a team of horses a-coming. And it was coming down Ash Road, and they said that, Mom said that horses was just a runaway wagon. She said you could hear the horses. I mean, their hooves just a-pounding the ground in the wagon. You know how they'll bounce and all the racking and they's a-making. And she told her they'd better jump back through that gates, so they did. And they heard it, and it come right up to the house, and then no wagon. No, nothing, just the noise, and it stopped. And in this story, you have what's called a prefixing. It's a feature that a lot of people talk about, but it's not a feature that happens that much in regular conversation, except for certain parts of Tennessee, in the Smoky Mountains, for example. So why does it come up in this story? And it comes up in this story, Burkett writes, because features such as the a prefix are strongly associated with Appalachia. Younger speakers like Jeff, the storyteller in this case, can use them to perform their Appalachian-ness, even though the story being told is a generic ghost story. So with certain features weaved into the discourse, people can create their Appalachian identities. Got a question here. When I was a child, neighbors who had lived in Alabama used the pronouns thee and thou. Can you explain that again? Nope, don't have any explanation of that one whatsoever. Would have been really cool to get, though. Just in case you run across any recordings of there, please let me know. The next chapter deals with language and identity. Jennifer Kramer does perception studies, amongst many other things. And in doing those, she tries to figure out what people think about different dialect varieties. So there are the kind of maps in the book that have people circling different regions saying, hey, who speaks this here? Who speaks that there? And in doing that, they get an understanding of what people think about certain regions and whether they identify or not with certain regions. So let me share this map from the book and it's handwritten, so I'm just going to try to translate here for you. This is Kentucky. And its identification. Here is Hick, here is normal city talk, middle Kentuckian, and country bumpkin. And in this person's perception of what's going on, you can see the different dialect areas and clearly what they identify with and what they don't identify with in here. Show you one more here. A little different. This says Western, slightly country, Southern country. Apparently they have more kinds of grits in the grocery store here. This is more urban, still country. And then this is hillbilly country accent. but with a heart. So notice the different orientation in here. And what Kramer does is goes through people's perceptions and results from perception studies and focuses on what people think about Appalachia and finds a wide variety of identifications with and then sometimes not so with Appalachia. The next two chapters deal with language and gender, Christine Mounts and Jay Insco, and then language and ethnicity with Becky Childs. Don't have time to go through all of their findings. One important thing to point out, though, is that here in language and ethnicity, and then several other chapters of the book, we try to point out and illustrate the variation of African Americans in Appalachia, who have been here since the 18th century, and the varieties of English that they have. They have a diverse range of language variation in Appalachia, African Americans, and they share some qualities with white communities and some with African American communities in lowland areas. So there's a lot of good work on African American English in Appalachia. The other chapters deal with many intriguing and interesting things. I think the chapter that's going to get the most reading and the most interest from people is chapter 8, Jordan Lovejoy's chapter. It deals with memes, and it deals with Appalachian identity in memes and the representation of language in those. Jordan Lovejoy is a folklorist coming out of Ohio State University. One of the few things good coming out of Ohio State University. And with her work, what you have is a study of representation in these memes. So just to show you this part here, this is the website. There's a companion website. If you're a teacher, there's resources by chapter, and every chapter has study questions and project ideas. And then there's general resources for language in Appalachia here. And I want to show you just some of the memes here. By the way, all the resources are available for download as a zip file or individual chapters. I'm just going to, I'll blow this up here. This is Jordan Lovejoy's questions. And she goes through different folklore interpretations, but also understandings of what memes are. The language variation, but then the representation of woman's work in this meme here. See if I can blow this up and move this over. This one here, teaching lady, along with this. And then different kinds of interpretations here from the Communist Manifesto. Yeah, I'm trying to refocus here. Well, if you go to dialects.wvu.edu, you might actually be able to see. I'm not sure I can get this any bigger or clearer. Boom, boom. But she goes through here, this one, share if your ancestors was them flat-foot and unionists. You can see this nice was leveling and demonstrative them in this case. Here's Dale Earnhardt shirtless on a horse. Saddle up, comrade, we're seizing them means. So labor and political movements and Appalachia and Dale Earnhardt. So Jordan Lovejoy's chapter does have it all. The remaining chapters, Isabel Shepard does a wonderful job dealing with authenticity and language in literature and how authors represent place and authenticity in their writing. Audra Slocum handles language and identity in K through 12 education. Stephanie Brett Dunstan and Andrea Yeager handle language, identity, and college students. What is it like to be Appalachian, to sound Appalachian, and go to college in an area where your dialect variety may not be as appreciated? They handle what the consequences of that are on a college campus from their very in-depth study college campuses and Appalachians on those campuses. The book has a foreword and afterword by two very special people, Donna Christian and Walt Wolfram. In 1975, 1976, Wolfram and Christian wrote what was the first book-length study of English in Appalachia. It was part of Donna Christian's dissertation work. Walt was a professor at what became University of District Columbia, and their work was a classic for several decades. And it was an honor to have both Donna and Walt write basically bookends for the work in this book. I think I've talked enough now. I would love to take some more questions and respond to some of the questions that I may have missed in here, especially the glottal stop question. It says, beyond Appalachia, perhaps. Let's see. Whoop, someone new comment. Notice when listening to West Virginia Public Radio that certain reporters from the Charleston area put a forceful amount of popping emphasis on syllables that begin with p, b, g. Is there a term for that? No, but my wild guess is that two things are going on. One, in some of those, in things like pat, tea, kite, words like this, there's a breath of air called aspiration that comes out. That breath of air is going to really hit the microphone, and it might have to do with microphone sensitivity. A lot of it might have to do with just wanting to make sure that they have enough differentiation in their sounds. So they're really putting on a radio performance voice in terms of consonants. And certain consonants are getting brought across forcefully enough so you can actually hear the aspiration in them. So that's my wild guess. There are I'll bring up the one dialect feature that may be coming up also. There is different stress patterns in dialects. So in some northern variety, in most northern varieties, you get cement, Detroit, and police. In some southern varieties, at the very least, you used to get cement, police, Detroit, where the stress was on the first syllable. So there are syllable difference between varieties also. Miss Nelson wants me to share my thoughts on Hillbilly Elegy going to the big screen. Will it have an impact on outside views of Appalachian culture? It probably won't have any change in Appalachian culture. The people who are going to watch Hillbilly Elegy and go, oh yeah, that's Appalachia, I knew it, probably had those thoughts in the first place. What a lot of people have done, Elizabeth Catt and numerous others, have tried to repair the kinds of stereotype damage that J.D. Vance has done in presenting an Appalachia that is so flat that most people can't recognize it. I didn't put any time into studying dialect variation in Hillbilly Elegy, book or big screen, so I don't have anything there to say itself. But I'm hoping that people will keep reading the assessments and analysis of Hillbilly Elegy, and maybe then we can get some better understanding of Appalachia out to other parts of the nation. I'm still pondering. Okay, Glottal Stop seems to be. I want to ask about Glottal Stop. Is there an example? I want to answer this question. Is Glottal Stopping here something like instead of butter, is something butter? Like I used to have some. Yeah. Okay. I used to have for my kids' soccer coach. Used to have a soccer coach, a wonderful fellow who always talked about his water ball, and his water. And always used to make the kids go get their water ball, and the kids loved it. They picked up this glottal stopping just wonderfully. Glottal stopping is traditionally a British feature. So instead of kitchen, you get kitten. And it is very, very frequent within England, and it is socially class restrained over there. Americans in general have what's called flapping. Flapping is in something like butter being butter. Butter is almost certainly the normal pronunciation, statistically speaking, the most frequent pronunciation for speakers in the US. But instead of a fully voiceless t, you get d, a quick tongue tap, which is called a flap. That flap is usually seen as an American feature, and the glottalization is usually seen as a British feature. So if you're seeing more glottal, an increase in glottal stopping, it may be an affinity to British varieties. I've known some people who really like British things and have thrown some British vowels around. Maybe glottalization is part of that also. I don't have a great answer on that one.
Let me try this. I hear it on the news. I hear newscasters do it. It used to be easy for me to say important, but now I want to say important. Skipping the T. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I hear it a lot more than I used to.
So syllable, this kind of elision, this kind of syllable loss is fairly normal in terms of language change. It's the way so much language change has happened that I'm not surprised it would be happening in words like that also. So yeah, that's just part of stress, just to some extent, that the unstressed syllable is getting worn away, as some of the differentiation in there. So yeah, syllable loss.
The word didn't.
Yeah, it's absolutely positively a feature, and it's flapping would also occur there, but if it's actually glottalization, maybe that's a feature that's one that we have not turned our attention to, not in this book in the slightest. So maybe that's something we do need to be looking at. All the time I find things that we need to be looking at. So yeah, that's probably one of them. I know there's a new, I know there is a consonant variation with business being bidness or cousin being cudden. And that's an older feature that has continued in some areas. Our Appalachian by Middle English or Scots-Irish hikes. So on the Scots-Irish side, the Scots-Irish one is something that's been overstated. There are some Scots-Irish features throughout Eastern dialects overall, and there are some features that do show up in Appalachia, but overall they're minor, and the influence is not that great. Most of the settlement was not done by Scots-Irish settlers, but there is definitely some influence, subject for court influence by Scotch-Irish settlers. So some, but not much. And in terms of Middle English, no more than any other variety within the U.S. I sometimes hear Mountain Dew instead of Mountain Dew. Mountain Dew. Ambisyllabicity. So this is my wild guess is that this is probably a feature of stress, that the second syllable in tan instead of mountain, and the glottalization and it being unstressed, that the second syllable is getting equal stress, mountain dew. And with that, you're getting the second, the beginning of that second syllable, officially called the onset, actually enunciated. So in other words, it's getting aspirated also. That is my guess there, that you're getting even stress across. Do I see a decline in Appalachian Englishes across the region? No, people are still speaking English in Appalachia. They're still there. Are there a decline in some vernacular features that are stigmatized? Yes, but they're not going away. They are still there, and they are taking up local identity work, essentially. And but are vowel systems changing? Is language change happening in the different varieties of English in Appalachia? Yeah. English in Appalachia at the end of the 21st century will not be the same as it is now, guaranteed. All right, here's one of our authors, Jordan Elizabeth Lovejoy. Silas House recently told young Appalachians they shouldn't feel pressure to change the way that they speak. He used the example of pronouncing flower as flour, which is monophthongization on gliding. Can you talk about what's going on there, as well as other features you've seen popping up in Appalachian Englishes and younger Appalachians? Generational differences you've noticed. In that particular one, that is, and this is a feature that Silas House, who I so fortunately was able to read once, is certainly has. This is a feature where the diphthong ow, which is a two-part vowel, starts at one part of your mouth, ow, and then goes to another part of your mouth, ooh, like cow, where that two-part vowel becomes a one-part vowel. And it does this happen to be before an sound, so it sounds a bit different, but it's called ungliding, or if you want a really fancy term, it's called monophthongization. And yeah, he actually, I believe now has some t-shirts. He's moved into the t-shirt land. A local store near him is selling on Etsy. Differences between the younger Appalachians. Younger Appalachians are repurposing vernacular features as part of their local identity. One thing Jennifer Kramer talks about in here is covert and overt prestige. Overt prestige is where you find language given to follow institutional norms. Covert prestige is where you find language performed in order to pick up street cred, in order to pick up praise from your own group of folks. And a lot of features that were common and perhaps not remarked on before the middle of the 20th century have become features of country talk, have become features that people take local pride in. And they've taken up a new identity. Some things are so frequent they don't get used, but the ones who have dropped in terms of frequency, the things like leveled was or demonstrative them that are not as common as they used to be, are really used often as performance of local identities for speakers. So people are being creative with them. Anything you want to add about folklore, Jordan? Hey, Sean.
Hey, I'm just coming. I didn't see any new questions, but we'll give them a minute here. And I'll just remind people that Rabbi Leaf is next Tuesday at noon. And this was fascinating, Kirk.
Thank you.
As usual, we could go on and on, I'm sure, about all the quirks of language. And thank you. If you want the book, it's at wvupressonline.com. There it is. Lovely cover. And,
it is a fabulous cover, I have to say. There's a lot to that. Where can I do? There we go. Yep, it's a lovely cover in there.
Striking. Yes.
Yep. WU Press does a wonderful job. It's not a large shop, 4 to 6 people, but they do an absolutely bang up job.
And they've been a great friend of this program over the years. So thank you to them. Hey, thanks everyone who attended, and we'll see you next week.
All right.
Have a great weekend.